Thank you all for coming and welcome to the Institute for Korean Studies' first anniversary conference entitled Assessing Korean Democratization and Democracy from Molotov Cocktails to Candlelight. My name is Seung-Kyung Kim, Korea Foundation Professor in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures and Director of the Institute for Korean Studies. The Institute for Korean Studies was founded just last year, 2016, within the School of Global and International Studies, with the generous support from the Korea Foundation, IU Korean alums, and the university. The Institute promotes interdisciplinary approach to the understanding of Korea on campus and beyond, and advances cultural fluency by providing programs for students, faculty, and community. Today's conference was made possible with funding from the Dr. Lee Se-ung Distinguished Lecture Series on Korean Global Affairs, and I would like to thank Dr. Lee. I would also like to thank the Institute's Associate Director, Dr. John Finch over there, Assistant Director Keith Seidel, I think he is probably outside, and our undergraduate intern, Ms. Taewon Lee, for all their work to prepare for this conference. Our conference starts with the question, what is the present state of South Korean democracy? With a question mark. After almost 4 decades of authoritarian rule, the country gradually democratized. First by having a free and fair direct presidential election in 1987, then by transferring authority to a civilian president in 1992, and finally by having a representative of the opposition party win the presidency in 1997. Without a doubt, building and maintaining a democracy is a process rather than a one-time event. And the South Korean democracy has experienced many challenges in the last 2 decades. Yet the past year has arguably been the most turbulent as the country went through the shocks of corruption scandals and investigations involving the largest conglomerates, presidential aides, and the president herself, climaxing in her impeachment and imprisonment. Do the recent events reveal irreparable flaws in Korean democracy, or do they, particularly the instrumental role played by the civil society, indicate vibrancy and progress? Today we have scholars and a former US ambassador to Korea at IU who will share their experiences, interpretations, and hopes for Korean democracy. We will start with the keynote speech, and after the keynote speech, during the lunch hour, we were fortunate to get this independent film that was made during the 6-month candlelight demonstration, and I was able to get that link day before yesterday. So we will run that during lunchtime. Anybody who would like to stay, you can go in and out, and just watch a segment of it, that'll be fine too. And after that, Dr. Susan Hwang will introduce the 3 scholars who will present their research about South Korea's democratization. The academic presentations will be followed by a roundtable kind of discussion between our dean, Lee Feinstein, and former US Ambassador to Korea, Kathleen Stevens, and Dr. Ria Che will introduce them. Now, it is my great pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker, Dr. Bruce Cumings. Gustavas and Ann Swift distinguished service professor in history and the college at the University of Chicago. Professor Cumings is a renowned scholar of modern Korean history whose groundbreaking two-volume study on the origins of the Korean War is perhaps the most important work yet published about 20th century Korea. His research and teaching focus on modern Korean history, 20th century international history, U.S.-East Asian relations, East Asian political economy, and American foreign relations. He has published widely on all of these topics, and I'm going to list just two of his most recent books that include Dominion from Sea to Sea, Pacific Ascendancy and American Power, published by Yale University Press, and a synoptic single-volume study of the origins of the Korean War, The Korean War, A History, published by Random House. His teaching and scholarship have earned him many awards. He was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 1999 and is the recipient of fellowships from the Ford Foundation, NEH, and the MacArthur Foundation. He was also the principal historical consultant for the Thames Television PBS documentary, Korea, the Unknown War. The title of his talk today is The Importance of Reconciling Regional Histories in Korea's Democratization. Please welcome Professor Cumings.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kim, for that lovely and generous introduction. I did something this morning that I never should have done, especially because I did it once before, and that is I was scheduled to give a lecture at Notre Dame at 10 in the morning, drove over from Chicago, and was sitting at a coffee shop at what I thought was 10 minutes to 9, and I didn't realize the time zone had changed, and so I hustled over to Notre Dame to give a lecture. Today I did the same thing, only it's worse because I was in Korea for a conference this past week and got into O'Hare Airport at 8 p.m. last night and got in a car and drove down here. And I thought I did pretty well, even though the road is completely screwed up. 37. I learned this morning that that's all the fault of Vice President Pence. But anyway, I think I'm here. Anyway, I'm certainly glad to be here. What I want to do is to examine 3 episodes of extreme violence before, during, and after the Korean War, and then try to draw some conclusions about the contribution to civil society and democratization of the Republic of Korea from these episodes, and especially the activities of the survivors and victims. I want to say this is not just a story about South Korea. It's also a story about the United States because the United States was intimately involved in all 3 of these episodes of violence. And we all need to reflect on that history. I also wanted to talk about this aspect of Korean democratization because most of what we know and what we've learned about Korean democratization happened in Seoul. And it was often a matter of elite students from the great universities in Seoul confronting a military dictatorship. And that is itself a stirring and wonderful story because I don't think there's any developing country in the world that has had such a successful democratization as South Korea. Still flaws and all of that, but nonetheless a very successful democratization. And in spite of the terrible violence of the 3 episodes that I'm going to talk about, the survivors and victims are now, I think, reconciled to what happened because they fought a very hard struggle to get recognition, ultimately to get memorials, the names of victims of massacres etched into stone tablets in the smallest villages and in large museums. And so they feel that they're now a part of South Korea. We've heard a lot about Korean history in recent weeks from President Trump. 25 years of Democratic and Republican bumbling in regard to North Korea with no, no successes, nothing worked. Now he's going to fix it. That's probably the most cursory example of the way so few Americans know anything about Korean history. Actually, President Clinton succeeded in freezing the plutonium facility at Yongbyon for 8 years. And it was President Bush who was responsible for letting that agreement slip between his fingers. If Americans don't know much about Korean history, I think they don't know anything usually about a small island off the southern coast of Korea called Jeju. But in many ways, it's where the beginnings of the Korean War can be found, in the sense that starting in April 1948, for the first time, leftist and rightist forces began using violence against each other, which turned into a major peasant war on Jeju Island under the auspices of the American occupation. The U.S. sent 25,000 combat troops into Korea, not on June 25th, 1950, when the war we see conventionally as the Korean War began, but on September 8th, 1945, and established an American military government for 3 years that deeply shaped post-war Korean history. But on Jeju Island, the American authorities essentially let the Jeju Islanders run their own affairs for almost 3 years. All through Korea, after the Japanese surrender, people's committees were set up at local levels. They were all over South Korea. The North Koreans essentially based their regime on those committees and communized them, but in the South they were very diverse. They often had nationalists rather than communists running them. And on Jeju Island, nothing really happened until April 1948 to get the attention of the American authorities in Seoul. There was a military government team on Jeju Island, but they let the island people run their own affairs. Things all ended with a rebellion in April 1948 when Jeju Islanders decided they didn't want to be part of the election being held only for South Korea, that an election for South Korea would inevitably divide the peninsula permanently. And out of that came a guerrilla insurgency that lasted for about 18 months and was put down with extraordinary brutality. Jeju Island is a beautiful place. It has obsidian rock from Mount Hala, the Halasan volcano, which sits toward not really in the center, but toward the southeast of the island. The weather is sort of like San Luis Obispo or San Diego. It's mostly temperate and beautiful the year around. The natives complain that the wind blows too much. It also has a history of separatism from the mainland, a history of Jeju people thinking that they are separate, and it's the location of the only real dialect of the Korean language that mainlanders or other Koreans might have trouble understanding. Now, after Syngman Rhee came to power in 1948 as the first president of the Republic of Korea, silenced his officials and blamed the whole rebellion on alien communist agitators, Koreans and Americans inside the U.S. military government attributed the origins of the insurgency there to the long tenure of the Jeju governing committees and subsequent police and right-wing youth group terrorism. particularly the Northwest Youth, which was not really a group of youths. These were often middle-aged men who had fled North Korea from the northwestern part of North Korea, formed the Northwest Youth. And when you look at internal American military government documents, it's routinely referred to as a terrorist organization, and that's exactly what it was. But before that, Congressman visiting General John R. Hodge, who was the commander of the occupation, told the congressman that Jeju was a truly communal area, and I'm quoting him now, that is peacefully controlled by the People's Committee without much Comintern influence. Comintern meaning the Communist International, which had been disbanded in, I think, 1942, but anyway. The military government carried out a public opinion survey and estimated that approximately 2/3 of the population on the island were moderate leftist in their opinions, and that the chairman of the largest organization was not a communist and was, quote, very pro-American. This survey in mid-1948 determined that Jeju had been subjected to a campaign of official terrorism. The Counterintelligence Corps, which was one of the most valuable organizations for me as an historian, their files are full of very interesting things on Korea in this period, said that the governor at the time was an extreme rightist, a mainlander with connections to right-wing youth groups. He was ruthless and dictatorial. He thought anyone who didn't support Syngman Rhee was automatically a leftist, and tried his best to prevent any meetings at all by left-wing groups. As it happened, about 10% of the Jeju population was killed, 85 or 90% of them by terrorists or official military or police folks. And another, some tens of thousands fled to Osaka, where many of them still remain today, or their descendants. About 30,000 people died out of a population of 300,000. The interior of the island was completely denuded of people and villages. People were concentrated on the coasts in protected villages, and then everything in the interior was burned. So tens of thousands of homes, in addition to the people on the island, were burned down, and villages just disappeared. The U.S. directed this suppression. Colonel Rothwell Brown, who was a high officer in the military government, was a key person in deciding to set up the protected villages and in looking the other way at the enormous slaughters going on. It takes a lot of time and effort to kill 10,000 people over a course of 18 months. Rothwell Brown went on to have a career in covert operations in the CIA and other American intelligence agencies. I had tried to get FOIA, Freedom of Information Act, documents on Mr. Brown, but so far never came up with anything. Basically, by May of 1949, the island had been subdued, and not much at all happened during the Korean War. In 1960, when Syngman Rhee was overthrown in a popular uprising, you had a democratic government under Chang Myon for 1 year. And at that time, and this is one of the most heartrending aspects of the Kwangju Rebellion, people tried to dig up the bodies from mass graves of their loved ones, and actually did so in many cases, more than a decade after the fact. And they set up stone memorials to the dead. When Park Chung-hee made his military coup in May of 1961, he soon got about the business of destroying all those markers and stones. It took the June 1987 uprising, which finally overthrew the military dictatorship in Korea, and the very hard efforts of the survivors, victims that were still alive, survivors, descendants of the people who died on Jeju Island, to get a thorough inquiry from the government, to publish just reams of information of all kinds, documents, oral histories, and finally, a wonderful peace museum on Jeju Island. I toured Jeju for 2 weeks in February of shows how old I am. February of 2014. I actually wasn't alive in 1914, although I know that comes as a surprise to some of you. Anyway, yeah, I went around with a couple of other scholars, and I had been to the Peace Museum before. It's a very impressive edifice, enormous. But what was so striking, from village to village, where entire villages had been wiped out, there were granite monuments, very much on the model of Maya Lin's Vietnam War Memorial, where people had inscribed the names of those who died in the village and the dates and their age. And it's really shocking. I mean, you see 55,000 plus soldiers dead at the Vietnam Memorial, but to go to a village and see a 6-month-old child and an 85-year-old man be the beginning and the end of all those who died is really a terrible thing. If there's one point I'd like to get across today, and I say this in the wake of another conference I was at. I've been doing, as you can tell, too much conferencing, but someone raised their hand in the audience and said, North Koreans don't care about human lives, so how can we deal with a country like that that has nuclear weapons? That was one of the oldest shibboleths in the Oriental despotism discourse, that Asians don't care about human life. I actually think these monuments wouldn't exist if Koreans didn't care so much about history, about recording what actually happened as opposed to what the government said happened, and especially what happened to their relatives. In spite of about 30% of Koreans being Christian, I still think it's a very secular nation. Many Christians are also Buddhists and Confucianists at the same time. And the afterlife for Koreans is in what in Europe used to be called the great chain of being: the grandparents, parents, the children, the children's offspring, grandchildren, the progeny, so on and so forth through history. I several times in my career have had the experience of a Korean meeting me for the first time or second time, and then pulling out a book to show what his grandfather did in fighting off the Manchus in 1637 or something like that. I don't know how many of us can trace our families back to 1637, but it is a country where people care in their hearts as deeply as possible for their parents and for their children and for their family line. And I think that was the primary impetus for the Jeju Islanders to just keep going until they finally got some relief for something that happened 70 years ago. The second episode I want to talk about is the Nagin Lee Massacre during the Korean War, another violent episode and a very vexed one because, in my view, Americans in general and the Pentagon in particular have never come clean about what happened at Nagin Village. But one American remembered what happened. He was a Virginian named Art Hunter. And in the summer of 2000, and for every summer for the previous half century, he had occasionally awakened in the middle of the night with cold sweats, imagining the faces of two people, a man and a woman, hovering above his bed. These two weathered faces had made his life a living hell, and when they haunted him, he would arise, get his hunting rifle, go sit on the porch, and smoke a cigarette. In 1991, Hunter finally got the US government to give him full disability pay for his severe post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, but the nightmares still came to him in his home in the foothills of Virginia's Blue Ridge Mountains. On September 30th, 1999, a woman named Chun Jun-ja appeared on the front page of the New York Times, dressed as if she were yet another middle-aged and middle-class Korean housewife going shopping. Instead, she stood at the mouth of a tall tunnel in Nagin Village, which is right in central Korea, central South Korea, and pointed to a hill where, she said, in July 1950, quote, American soldiers machine-gunned hundreds of helpless civilians under a railroad bridge. She and other survivors went on to say that they had been petitioning their government and the American government for years, seeking compensation for this massacre, but had been completely stonewalled in Seoul and Washington. Meanwhile, the article also carried the testimony of American soldiers who did the firing, who said that their commander had ordered them to fire on civilians. Art Hunter was one of these soldiers shooting into a white-clad mass of women, children, and elderly people gathered under a railroad bridge. 2 months after this story, a Washington Post reporter learned that civilians had been under that bridge for 3 days and that American soldiers repeatedly returned. Chung Gu-hoon, who was 17 years of age, told the Washington Post reporter they were checking on every wounded person and shooting them if they moved. Other soldiers climbed down toward a drainage pipe where dozens of villagers had taken shelter and began shooting into families. What happened at Nagin Lee also grew out of the legacy of suppressed aspirations of Koreans in 1945. Local guerrillas in 1950 were remnants of the communal hopes of Koreans to build their own government when they were liberated from Japan. Nagin Village is located in the county of Yeongdong, in a remote and mountainous region where the borders of 3 provinces meet, and it's where people's committees emerged in August 1945. Yeongdong was often called a red county throughout the late 1940s, and this, of course, had something to do with the violence meted out against local people. An American doctor named Clesson Richards ran a Salvation Army hospital in Yeongdong from 1947 until leaving just before the war. And he said, guerrilla warfare was around us all the time. And I'm quoting him, we had many commies as patients. The police would keep an eye on them, grill them, and when they had all possible information out of them, take them out and stand them before a firing squad. This wall was near the hospital. We could hear the men being shot. Dr. Richards said this very matter-of-factly because, in his opinion, quote, the commies were ruthless, although they had no anti-foreign feeling and didn't bother us. So essentially, by the late 1940s, any Korean who had been a member of the People's Committee, any Korean a member of a leftist union or a peasant union was labeled a commie. And that was that. Again, Americans like the military advisory group officer James Hausman directed much of the counterinsurgency against South Korean guerrillas in 1948 and 49. And so Americans have a hand both in creating the situation by not recognizing those people's organizations when they first appeared, and instead imposing a military government on South Korea. I mean, just as a matter of fact, the U.S. goal in coming into South Korea under international law was only to disarm the Japanese and send them home. Instead, the State Department had decided, really within 6 months of Pearl Harbor, excuse me, really within 6 months of Pearl Harbor, that the U.S. needed to control either all or a part of Korea, that it wanted preponderant power in Korea because a revived Japan was going to be the centerpiece of post-war American security in the Pacific, and South Korea would have an important economic relationship, or they thought it would, to Japan. So there was planning for several years for an occupation, and basically the idea of taking the Japanese surrender was a fig leaf for the United States wanting to have preponderant power in Korea. The Pentagon issued a report on the Nagin Lee incident. I think it was 11 o'clock at night, and there were two reporters at the Pentagon when the report was issued. It was a complete whitewash that denied that there had ever been orders to kill civilians. But because a lot of North Koreans and guerrillas were either had no uniforms or were dressing up in civilian clothes, mostly white cotton raiment, what Americans called white pajamas in the Korean War, rather than the black pajamas of the Viet Cong. A lot of civilians were killed because it was very hard to tell enemy from friend. This is something that you see throughout the documents from the summer of 1950, but you also see it in Life magazine, Saturday Evening Post, the other major picture magazines that wrote about Korea in the summer of 1950. There were orders to kill civilians. Art Hunter, whatever the Pentagon may have thought, Art Hunter surely knew the truth of what happened in Nagin Village so many years ago, but why did it haunt him? I think it's because a young man on the giving end of a rifle intuits a fundamental human truth about warfare, that the soldier is there to kill but also to save and protect. And I'm quoting now, "The soldier, be he friend or foe, is charged with the protection of the weak and unarmed. It's the very essence and reason for his being. When he violates this sacred trust, he not only profanes the entire culture, but threatens the very fabric of international society." The author of this moving statement went on to say that, quote, "The traditions of fighting men are long and honorable, based upon the noblest of human traits, sacrifice." And that statement was from General of the Army Douglas MacArthur. But by coming forward and telling their stories, survivors like Chun Jun-ja did something wonderful for Art Hunter. They sought him out and discussed what had happened, and thus made it possible for him to sleep at night and to begin purging himself of a terrible guilt. The third episode of extreme violence that I want to talk about is the Kwangju Rebellion in 1980, a much better known rebellion. It was the touchstone of protests throughout the 1980s, and in many ways was the death knell of the dictatorship, because this was a scene rebellion. Television cameras were on the scene, particularly Japanese TV, essentially witnessing a massacre of young people, girls and boys, really, high school and college students. It isn't a stretch to say that an entire generation of young people were raised in the shadow of Kwangju, just as American students in the 60s lived with Vietnam and the civil rights movement. American officials often saw the students' protests in a narrow empirical light. The students claimed U.S. involvement in Chun Doo-hwan's two coups d'etats. There was one in December 1979 when he made a coup d'etat within the military. It was a complete breach of the operational control mechanism in which the U.S. has operational control of the South Korean Army. It sent high generals in South Korean Army scampering through tunnels across the street to U.S. 8th Army headquarters, and ended up with Chun Doo-hwan being in control of the formidable South Korean military. In April of 1980, Chun Doo-hwan took over the Korean Central Intelligence Agency, which was the most powerful political agency at the time in Korea. And then, utilizing the Kwangju Rebellion, he proceeded to finish his coup in the summer of 1980 and declare himself president after going through spurious constitutional procedures. Anyway, the students were charged that the US had to have been involved because we had to release troops to go to Kwangju to fight the rebels. And the US would say, no, that was a matter of domestic affairs, and the US can't interfere in South Korean domestic affairs. Of course, this is a complete oxymoron or catch-22 in that if you are in control of the 650,000 strong South Korean army and you let troops, including troops that you knew to have brutalized miners at a strike in April of 1980, you let those troops go, you're involved willy-nilly, whether you want to be involved or not. I think the other kind of involvement, and this is something the US has done always in Korea, was after the fact, not only to deny American involvement, but to say the most important thing is not what was going on in Kwangju, but the stability of the country and the possibility that North Korea would take advantage of a rebellion like the one in Kwangju. One of the more interesting things about North Korea is when you look back at rebellions, Jeju Rebellion, Yosu Suncheon in October 1948, which was connected to the Jeju Rebellion. Yosu and Suncheon are cities in the southwest of Korea. The 1960 overthrow of Syngman Rhee, the 1961 coup, and other events in South Korea that are very disruptive and destabilizing. The DMZ always seems to get very quiet. And what that has told me is the North Koreans want to fight on their own terms. They do not want to fight because of something going on in South Korea. If they're prepared to fight, they will fight. There is some newer evidence that I was just reading in preparing this lecture that apparently Kim Il-sung did say if this Kwangju Rebellion continues to unfold. It unfolded throughout South Cholla province, not all of the province, but smaller towns outside of Kwangju were also involved. And if it were to unfold into a mass movement, then North Korea might consider ways of intervening. But in any case, they did not intervene. And in Washington, you had Jimmy Carter, who was the president, I think a very fine president who did a lot for human rights around the world, particularly in Latin America. You'll have to excuse my swallowing and so on, because for me it's about 3 in the morning, but, and I'm still in Korea. Anyway, Jimmy Carter was known as a paragon of human rights, but in the case of Korea, Zbigniew Brzezinski, his national security advisor, and Richard Holbrooke, a high State Department official, convinced him that Korea was a matter of national security, Pacific security, and therefore we were not going to in any way side with the demonstrators in Kwangju. Richard Holbrooke actually told the New York Times that there's been far too much attention to Kwangju right in the middle of it, and much less to the problem of security on the peninsula, namely North Korea. Unlike either the Jeju Rebellion or the Nagin Lee Massacre, at that time, Koreans didn't blame Americans for what was going on. They were all too familiar with the Koreans who were suppressing them. The victims of the massacre in Nagin Lee, of course, blamed American soldiers for firing on them, but it didn't emerge either in Jeju or Nagin Lee into an anti-American movement. But in the 1980s, the Kwangju Rebellion led to a full-fledged anti-American movement. Some Americans were often afraid to walk down the streets in Seoul and other cities. The embassy became, it looked like the Beirut embassy with gigantic concrete abutments in front of it. And when I was there in 1985 and 1986, by the way, I was denied a visa to South Korea from 1972 to 1985 because of criticisms of the Pak dictatorship that I published. So I was a man without a Korea. I couldn't go to North Korea, couldn't get a visa, couldn't go to South Korea because I couldn't get a visa. I went back with Kim Dae-jung when a number of foreigners came back with him to try and give him some protection. When he came back from exile, he had been at Harvard. And when I walked down the streets, I was all prepared to ask anybody if they said, "Are you an American?" I'd say, "No, I'm from New Zealand." Because New Zealanders had not been involved in any of the violence in Korea. The Kwangju Rebellion was not as big as the Tiananmen crisis in China in 1989, but it was very similar as a cataclysmic political event that affected an entire generation. Later on, people would find that students thought, when they were asked what's the most important event in modern Korean history, they wouldn't say the Korean War, they would say the Kwangju Rebellion, because it pierced the hearts of an entire generation. There were attacks on American cultural centers in the 1980s, firebombs, there were suicides. When I was part of this delegation going back with Kim Dae-jung in 1985, when we arrived at Kimpo Airport, not Incheon Airport, but Kimpo Airport, they put us on a bus, and on one side of the street were masses and masses of supporters of Kim Dae-jung, most of them middle-aged and older, in basically working-class clothing, and they were saying that Kim Dae-jung was their great leader. And then on the other side of the street were young people, the age of many of the students in this auditorium, who were dressed in Darth Vader-like get-ups with a helmet and mask and body armor. They were in the riot police, and it looked as we drove into Seoul as if Korea was divided between the demonstrators and the riot police. And that's what downtown Seoul looked like for much of the mid-1980s. There were dozens of riot buses full of riot police parked 24 hours a day in downtown Seoul. The campuses were completely shut down from time to time, particularly Yonsei University. And there was just a generational revolt against the dictatorship. As I said, many students would have blamed this on Kwangju and on American support for one dictator after another. But it's always seemed to me, since I went to Korea, not in the 1890s, but in the 1960s, that Korea had a much stronger civil society than people gave it credit for. So highly educated, such a highly educated populace. You would sit in tea rooms and hear people criticize Park Chung-hee back in the 60s, up one side and down the other. It made me come to think, and this is what I still think, that you needed a dictatorship if you were going to suppress that civil society. Anyway, as you will hear this afternoon, in June 1987, massive demonstrations throughout Korea, millions of people in the streets, a lot of them middle class, managed to convince Chun Doo-hwan and his very close ally No Tae-woo to hold direct presidential elections. And then in 1992, Kim Young-sam was elected the first non-military president going back to 1961. Furthermore, in 1996, Kim Young-sam put Chun Doo-hwan and No Tae-woo on trial for sedition, for being traitors, and for scarfing up hundreds of millions of dollars in political funds from the big chaebol groups. Even I was surprised by the total amount. I mean, Bill Clinton used to hold coffees for half an hour with visiting people and charge $50,000 for campaign expenses. The two dictators accumulated in the 1980s almost $1 billion in political funds. $900 million was the finding of investigations. And particularly for the people of Kwangju, since Chun Doo-hwan and No Tae-woo were instrumental in suppressing the Kwangju Rebellion, This was seen as a great victory, even if it came 15 years late. A scholar whom I know named Nagin Lee of Cheonnam University has argued that these trials of Chun Doo-hwan and Roh Tae-woo and Kim Dae-jung's election in 1997 represent a distinct victory for the people of Kwangju and South Chola province. So these two events, the prosecution of the two dictators and Kim Dae-jung's election, represented a reconciliation of two Koreas, not North and South Korea, but the Southwest and Jeju Island within South Korea. There have been, in many ways, three Koreas in the post-war period. I can get into that in the discussion if you want to talk about it. But one of Kim Dae-jung's great achievements was, with his successor, to spend 10 years reconciling with North Korea, something his successors decided not to follow up on. And another achievement was to reconcile South Korean people to themselves so that they can go to Kwangju and see the wonderful museum and memorial that has been erected there, or to Jeju, or to villages where the entire population died and see their grandparents' names etched into black marble. One of the points I want to leave with you is that when you have such a difficult history like this, 3 episodes, enough to make your stomach turn, each one of them, it's important to know what happened. Not just for the survivors and victims and for history's sake, but because when something is fully known, that the Jeju Islanders weren't a bunch of communists, but were local people trying to run their own affairs after the Japanese had ran their affairs for almost 4 decades. When you come to understand that, you can reconcile with your enemy on both sides. And I think that was what Kim Dae-jung was pushing toward with North Korea as well, a full knowledge of the history of the 20th century would make it possible for North and South Korea to understand each other better and eventually reconcile. His whole policy was not one of reunification, but reconciliation for a generation, at least. One of Kim Dae-jung's projects he called A History That Opens the Future. And it wasn't a matter of putting the past behind us, but knowing what was in the past in a way that had been prevented for 40 years of dictatorship, getting it out in the open, looking at it, understanding it, coming to understand the motivations of one's opponents or enemies, with all orthodox and heterodox points of view getting an airing. And his successor, Roh Moo-hyun, in April 2007, made an important speech where he cited this history in Korea of reconciliation through knowledge of history in criticizing Japanese leaders for still seeking to justify the actions of their forebears, or in the case of Abe Shinzo, his grandfather Kishi Nobusuke, the actions of their forebears in the 1930s and 40s instead of finding common understanding with their neighbors. And he said, Roh Moo-hyun said, true reconciliation, whether domestic or international, is possible only on a foundation of historical truth. The purpose of the various official and unofficial investigations of these episodes of violence was not to sow blame or refight Cold War battles, but to seek reconciliation between North and South and between the South Korean people themselves, to establish an understanding and an orientation that produces what the Germans call Verstehen, of one's former enemy, not sympathy, perhaps not even empathy, but an understanding of the principles and the history that guide one's adversary, even if one finds these principles abhorrent or deeply wounding to one's knowledge of what happened historically with the same enemy. After all, to blame one side, namely the communist side, for all the blood and agony of the past century since the past 107 years since Japan seized Korea is to fit an extraordinarily complex, merciless, and implacably brutal history through the eye of an ideological needle. What Koreans did, and I don't have time to get into this, but we can discuss it later through their Truth and Reconciliation Commission, through techniques of requiem under a fair system of justice, investigation, trial, testimony, apology, purge, reparations, in which both the victims and the perpetrators are heard on the South African model that South Korea learned so much from, people can finally reconcile, propitiate, and put their ghosts to rest. Once we view our history with an adversary from all sides, appeals can be made to that adversary's worldview. And of course, full recognition of what one side, in this case the South, did might lead to a better understanding of all the grievances husbanded by the other side. But perhaps the greatest gain is self-knowledge, for if you don't know yourself and what others think of you, rightly or wrongly, it's difficult to navigate a complicated world. I want to tout one of my former students, Soo-Gyung Hwang. Dr. Hwang now teaches at the University of Sydney, but she has a new book. It came out in November of 2016 called Korea's Grievous War, from Penn State University Press, Korea's Grievous War. And it's an account of 4 episodes of extreme violence before and during the Korean War. One of them is the Jeju Island events. Another is the roundup of the forced roundup of leftists in 1949 and 50 into an organization that was going to purge them of their presumed communist thoughts, almost all of whom were slaughtered as soon as the Korean War broke out by Syngman Rhee's forces. The Nagin Lee episode, and then the American bombing of North Korea, which left North Korea wasteland after 3 years of intense bombing, especially incendiary firebombing. She did much better than I did today at getting just the right tone for talking about these terrible incidents. It's a beautifully written book, at the same time harrowing. And anyone that wants to understand our troubles with North Korea that continue 72 years after the fact, after 25,000 Americans came into Korea, anyone who wants to understand that history should read this book. It is, in many ways, a masterpiece. Let me see if there's a couple things more that I want to say, and then I will open it up to questions. Yes, I went around Jeju Island in 2014 with Kim Sung-nae, who was an anthropologist, and with Henrik Kwan, another anthropologist who teaches at Cambridge. Kim Sung-nae teaches in Korea. Another book you all should read, not just to understand the Vietnam War, but to understand the Korean War, is Kwan's book called Ghosts of War in Vietnam, where a lively dialogue with and about ghosts inhabits the villages that he investigated, the social life and broader moral and political issues. Ghosts mingle together with familial and ancestral practices and become constitutive of village lore, collective memory, and historical meaning itself. These specters also deliver people from the terrible political fractures of right and left, good and evil, that defined the wars in Vietnam and Korea. It's a wonderful book, Ghosts of War in Vietnam. And then Kim Sung-nae is a really remarkable scholar who has devoted her academic career to explicating what happened on Jeju Island, and especially what happened in the minds of Jeju Islanders after the fact. So she studies their tales about ghosts, especially their dreams, their nightmares, their own PTSD. And among other things, she found that when a right-wing terrorist would kill somebody's son, in order not to be put into a category of a bad family and therefore blacklisted for decades in South Korea, you would tell the authorities, no, a communist killed my son. But then 10 years later, the mother would have a dream where in the middle of the dream she relives what actually happened as opposed to the legend that she was forced to develop about what happened. And it becomes a trauma, a continuing trauma in her dream life, if not, well, also in her real life. Anyone identified with the Jeju rebels or left-wing guerrillas around Nagin village during the Korean War, their families were blacklisted for decades thereafter. Couldn't get a passport. I had a student years ago at the University of Washington who had to, in order to get out of the country because she came from a politically bad family, she had to spend a number of months shrieking into the night at North Korea with the multiple, the mutual propaganda broadcasts that they do along the DMZ. I don't know if she was at the DMZ or at a radio station or something, but shrieking anti-communist stuff. Then they gave her her passport. She came to the University of Washington. Anyway, I think the restorative truths told by the survivors, family members, living victims of these Korean conflicts, not to mention the Korean War itself, are fruits of the popular struggle for democracy in Korea. It's a surge of civil society that's also a surge of suppressed information. Would never have been possible during the long decades of dictatorship. Suppressed memory is history's way of preserving and sheltering a past that possesses imminent energy in the present. The minute conditions change, that suppressed history pours forth. This particularly happened from 1960 to 61. I didn't quite understand this until touring Jeju and talking to people. But the election of Changmyeon meant that Koreans all over Southern Korea decided they would settle scores or find their murdered relatives, dig up mass graves, establish memorials, write books and articles about what had happened in the previous 15 years. And then it was all shut down by Park Chung-hee, who shut it down by turning over the marker stones and putting the families back in their blacklists. Because he knew the imminent power of these people if they were allowed to say what they wanted to say freely. Anyway, suppressed memory has come pouring out in South Korea. In the past 25 years, Koreans have produced hundreds of histories, memoirs, oral accounts, documentaries, films, and novels that trace back to the years immediately after liberation. And in some, summing up, they tell us that Koreans not only care about history, they care probably more deeply than we do. Why do they care more deeply than we do? Because we haven't had a war rage across our territory since 1865. We haven't had rebellions where large masses of people are slaughtered. I mean, we have Las Vegas, which is a pathetic, nihilistic thing, but the rebellions in Korea were about something. They were about the present and future of Korea. And in particular on Jeju Island, even though it's a separatist island, a deep desire for unification, and so they opposed the elections in 1948. But for an historian, kibitzing, so to speak, standing offside, not a Korean, although I actually consider myself a Korean American because my wife is Korean and my son is a Korean American, so that must make me a Korean American. In any case, that's what I put on census every 10 years just to boost the numbers. Anyway, for a person standing to the side, so to speak, like myself, as old as I am, it's just very gratifying to see things that I learned about 50 years ago being taken in hand by Koreans themselves, which is the way it should be, and giving us a completely different and much more believable history of post-war South Korea. So thank you very much, and I'll be happy to take any questions. I think we have about a half hour left, so. Yes, Mike.
You end on the note of memory. And I'm wondering, in terms of transmitting this reconciled memory, if you might want to comment on textbooks and history within Korea. Many people know about the problems between Japan and Korea, and the Japanese forget too much, the Koreans remember too much. But you focused intra-Korean today, and very movingly. What about trying to make this memory go forward to next generations? I know the books do that too, but it's the education system that is so powerful.
The education system in Korea is particularly powerful. It's centrally guided by the Ministry of Education. And a very good little piece of evidence that I'm right and she was wrong is that President Park Geun-hye, tried to get a textbook without all this stuff about left-wing rebellions and leftist this and protest that. She tried to get a textbook that would tell the real history of these episodes. And it was almost uniformly opposed, not only by intellectuals and professors, but by high school teachers. And I think there was one district that said they were going to adopt this textbook. And then I haven't studied this question, I only know what I read in the newspapers, but I think they decided not to use it after all. This is a tremendous evidence that Koreans have learned their own history and not going to be putting up with a textbook that glosses over things that are very important to them. In the past, of course, under the dictators, you had central control of the textbooks, and nothing, whatever I said today wouldn't get into that textbook. And if I were a high school teacher trying to talk about it, I would have gone directly to jail back during the dictatorship. But I haven't looked at recent high school textbooks. I have to tell you, I hope there aren't high school teachers here who are going to be offended, but I don't remember a thing from my high school textbooks. That's the one thing people don't tell you. My 10th grade history teacher, world history, Mr. Gaddy, he was our football coach in high school, and he gave us a thick world history textbook and told us to outline it. And when I was outlining it, somehow occurred to me that I was outlining an outline, and that textbooks are not really where you go to find the most accurate or well-informed history. So I'm sure the textbooks are a lot better than they used to be because the Korean people won't put up with textbooks that whitewash history. But I still find myself amazed that we've gone from what I remember as when I was your age, which was a dictatorship that brooked no opposition and seemed to control everything. And if they didn't, there would be 5 or 6 KCIA agents sitting in your classroom or following you around the streets, to the situation today where you can have candlelight parades by the millions for the impeachment of the president. And they're nothing but gentle, nonviolent, with mothers and fathers pushing their children in carriages, and following a constitution that brought down the president without any violence at all. I actually don't think that could happen in the United States today. There's so much violence and so many threats of violence in the United States because we're so polarized that if President Trump were impeached, I think you'd see major conflicts and probably quite a bit of violence. So it's a tribute to the maturity of Korean democratization. I'm already giving you my conclusion to your afternoon's program, but in my view, that was just a wonderful experience. It's something I twice have myself, I didn't have a candlelight, but I was moving in the mass of people in Seoul last year and back in 2002. And it's particularly remarkable for those of us that remember the tear gas and the riot police all over Seoul in the 1980s. So that's a way of not answering your question, Michael.
Thank you very much for another example of your brilliant scholarship on Korean history that also manages
Thank you.
to show us our unflattering vision in the mirror. You've done this time and again. I think it's very important. I'm sad to hear that there was a period when you couldn't get visas to Korea. I'm glad that you were able to come back to the United States last night after the many sharp things you've said. I'm also glad, it's clear to me that you wanted to place your emphasis on Jeju, but that you talked about Kwangju, because it's a very important episode. It's sad to think about the two halves of Zbigniew Brzezinski, who wrote with Friedrich a searing indictment of totalitarianism, but on the other hand hated communism so much that he gave him advice in that direction. A lot of us remember Carter as a paragon of human rights. He said that he planned to include human rights in his foreign policy thinking. And you've told us a sad story about another aspect of Carter that we often remember, that he was lamented as somewhat ineffectual. So I'm interested in hearing you say a little bit more about whether you think this was an aberration, right? That Carter's high purpose and low decisions were an aberration for him and perhaps in a larger sense for American foreign policy. Is there a sad story here about lecturing about high purpose on the one hand and on the other hand doing very low things?
Well, one of my students finished a dissertation a couple of years ago, In-gu Hwang, on the human rights policies toward Korea of several presidents, but particularly those for whom he could get documents. And that included Jimmy Carter. And reading that dissertation, which is coming out as a book, made me think more highly of Jimmy Carter. I always thought highly of him. And I thought he was undone by his advisors. And I had a close-up and personal look at that because one of my advisors at Columbia was Michael Oxenberg, who was Jimmy Carter's national security person for China. I took a seminar with Zbigniew Brzezinski many moons ago. And I knew they were not going to do anything but the wrong thing regarding Kwangju. They had no sympathy whatsoever for protests like that against dictators. And Brzezinski in particular just saw a communist under every tree and every bed. And if there was a hint that any of the Kwangju rebels were communists or working together with North Korea, that was going to be it for them. Things came to a head with Carter's advisors in June 1979 when Jimmy Carter visited South Korea. Now, I said I couldn't go to South Korea for 13 years. Actually, and this is a comedy of errors, I applied for a visa in the summer of 1979 in a little Seattle consulate office, and a nice young lady gave me a visa. That turned out to have been a mistake on her part, because when I got to Tokyo, they had my picture at all the airlines, if you can believe it. I mean, just unbelievable. And I was denied entry to the airliner going to Seoul. So a friend of mine who knows the Japanese media, an American, we went to the Korean embassy and said, if you don't give this guy a visa, we're going to have a press conference. So I sat in the office of the cultural attaché and observed bicultural Korean behavior in motion. He talked as freely and comfortably with me as anybody, because he had taught 17 years at Bethany College, a psychologist. And then when his underlings would come in, he would bolt ramrod straight, give them bark orders at them, and they would walk out the office. Now this story, the reason I'm bringing it up, has an important point. Anyway, he said, I'll arrange a visa for you. How long do you want to be there? I said, 3 days. What do you want to do? Buy books. Okay. I got a visa for 3 days. I got to Seoul. They said, you're going to buy books, right? Yes. And they followed me around for 3 days, 5 or 6 people on the detail, wasting their time and a lot of money. And then I left just as the red carpet was unfolding for Jimmy Carter to make his state visit. Now, it turns out that the cultural attaché was the brother-in-law of Kim Jae-gyu, who was the assassin of Park Chung-hee. Kim Jae-gyu was the head of the KCIA at the time. And pretty soon after the assassination, Mr. Chang, as his name was, the cultural attaché, was back in the United States and running away from corruption charges because since when does a psychologist from Bethany College get to be the cultural attaché at the Korean embassy in Tokyo? But then something much more interesting unfolded, and that is Jimmy Carter got so incensed with his talk, his private talks with Park Chung-hee, that he determined to return to his original policy that he campaigned on to take all of American troops out of South Korea and stop supporting the dictatorship. And there are several versions of what happened afterwards. They got him out of the office, out of the Blue House, and Secretary of Defense Brown and Brzezinski and Holbrooke and others started working him over and saying, you can't do this, this is, no matter what he said to you. Park Chung-hee apparently just made a mockery of Jimmy Carter's human rights policy. Regardless of what he may have said, we can't take our troops out of Korea, this is a crucial security issue, so on and so forth. Reporters said that there was an argument going on in the presidential limousine for at least 40 minutes before it finally got going again. And then in his memoirs, Jimmy Carter said that, the president only has a limited amount of power. For example, the bureaucracy told me that the North Korean army was much, much larger than we had been told. It went from 700,000 or 800,000 up to 1 million. And even a president can't find out if that's based on true facts of the situation or if it's like the WMD in Iraq, although he didn't use that analogy. And so one gets a sense of the president as having his heart in the right place and good intentions and being unable to fulfill them because of advisors who think they know more than he does about the security of the United States and what it needs. I'm sorry to take so long answering that question, but I thought it's a good question and illumines a very important episode in recent Korean history.
Hi. As I remember one of your books, The Korea's Place in the Sun, you said Korea has almost democratic politics. But the book was published about 10 years ago, and it happened, a lot of things happened for the last 10 years. So what about now?
Well, I think what I just said about the impeachment process following the Constitution is another success for Korean democratization and moves Korea closer to a full democracy. But I wrote that originally in 1997 when that book first came out, and then the second edition in 2005, because the national security law was still on the books, and anybody who listens to North Korean broadcasts, or you can't even read the North Korean Central News Agency reports in South Korea now, which is quite stupid because you need to read them if you want to figure out the regime. Things like that certainly prevented it from being a full democracy because the national security law, you can just drive a truck through its provisions, many of which actually violate the Constitution if you want to be legalistic about it. And there also was continuing suppression of people termed leftists or extreme leftists. I don't know that that will ever end until Korea is unified, but it's another reason why Korea was maybe 8 or 9 on a scale of 10 when it comes to democracy. But I actually think South Korea has a very strong democracy with a wider spectrum of opinion than we have in the United States. The Hangyorae Shinmun, which is a newspaper, I guess you would call it left-leaning, is ubiquitous on the newsstands. They even give it to you when you get on an airplane. And we don't have anything to the left of the New York Times, which is not very left-wing, if you ask me. That is a mass circulation newspaper in the United States. It's just one example of a wide political spectrum. And the way in which adults, often in their 30s and 40s, take things into hand with street protests that are nonviolent is a very important check on the regime. And if they didn't know that before, they know it now that Park is sitting in jail. Moon Jae-in is clearly very much attuned to what's going on in the street. And it seems to me that that's also a major achievement. Korea used to be called a country with a protest culture, as if there wasn't really much to protest about, but they loved to protest, those folks. And in fact, the Korean protest culture has become mature and very, very powerful. So I don't want to say who has the better democracy, South Korea or the United States, but we both have democracies with all kinds of problems and all kinds of conflicts, but nonetheless, we're very lucky to live in countries that can be called democracies.
Thank you, Professor Cumings. You mentioned that the civil society of South Korea is actually more powerful and developed than people usually think. I'm interested in this issue. Could you elaborate more about this? For example, how the civil society played a role in the democratization in South Korea. I also read that some scholars think Japan's civil society is rather unbalanced compared to its political institution of democracy. So I'm generally interested in the relationship between civil society and politics in East Asia's democracies. Thank you.
Well, I think you can go back to a very interesting book written about Korea in 1967 by Gregory Henderson called The Politics of the Vortex, which had an argument about the centrality of Seoul, somewhat like Paris in France. Everybody wants to go to Seoul. All the great universities are there and so on. And he said in that book that in 1960, Korea had more per capita college students than any country in the world. Or it may have been per capita college students in Seoul, because I don't remember exactly, but let's say in Seoul, because that's certainly true. And they saw themselves as part of a Confucian tradition of remonstrance, it's their responsibility to remonstrate with a government, the government. And that they did in 1960 when they overthrew Syngman Rhee. They did again in 1964 and 65 with protests against the normalization of relations with Japan. And then the third presidential election in 1971, Kim Dae-jung got 46% of the vote, and that was widely thought to be much less than he would have gotten because all kinds of money was poured into Park Chung-hee's campaign. And a year later, he declared martial law, and the Yushin Constitution came into effect, which made him president for life. Then he shut down civil society. He really shut it down with draconian emergency decrees of all kinds. And that lasted really until 1979, when major protests began again in Masan and Busan in the fall of 1979, and culminating in the assassination of Park, because it played a role in the assassination of President Park, and then culminating in the Kwangju Rebellion. Those are signs of a deeply repressed civil society that pops up and can make a lot of trouble even for such a well-elaborated military dictatorship. And then once Koreans were freed of the threat of jail or torture or whatever, after 1987, you had labor unions and student groups and political parties organizing across the board with a very strong civil society emerging in the 1990s. and ever since. I don't want to make any invidious comparisons with Japan. It's in many ways a wonderful country, but I don't think its civil society compares to Korea's in terms of the willingness of people to take into their own hands and do something about the issues that concern them. But since I don't know much about Japan and its civil society, I better shut up. That's just my impression.
Maybe we can take one more question, if anybody has.
I'm going to have a chance to talk a little this afternoon, so I didn't want to hold back. But thank you for your lecture, and I wanted to get your views on, you talked about the U.S. role and your analysis of it in a number of incidents, and but in the 1980s, what is your view of the U.S. role in the process that did result in the June 29th, 1987 declaration and what followed?
Well, a lot of what I know about this is anecdotal because we haven't had the documentation on the 1980s until recently, and I just read a long CIA report on June 29th, or what led up to it, that has been declassified. But what we as scholars tend to get are State Department and military declassification, but we don't get CIA declassification to any level that makes it really usable. We get summary reports rather than daily reports. And with military intelligence, I was particularly interested in what James Hausman and other people knew about Chun Doo-hwan's coup in 1980, 79, well, December 79 and again in the summer of 1980, because on the one hand, you have this image throughout post-war Korean history of Americans being innocent bystanders while something terrible happens. They're not really involved. Well, of course, we have to support Syngman Rhee or Park Chung-hee. We're not really involved, though. We're standing here, look at what's happening, but we can't really do anything about it. Meanwhile, there were Americans like James Hausman for 30 years and a number of others who stayed in Korea and that were at the intersection of American and Korean power. And particularly with Chun Doo-hwan being the head of military intelligence in 1979, Korean military intelligence, I would love to see the documentation on what his American counterparts thought about what he was doing, whether there was advanced knowledge and things like that. As to June 1987, I think it's fascinating and quite clear by now, although we need more evidence, that the events of the Philippines and maybe a couple of other places convinced the Reagan administration that Korea was going to have a major breakdown or even a revolution if something wasn't done to get the military out of power. This happened in the mid-1980s with envoys going to Korea, but to me, and Kathleen will perhaps appreciate this as much as anybody else, the top CIA man became ambassador to Korea. James, his name just went out, Lilly. For some reason, James Lilly's name always goes away just when I'm trying to remember it. Anyway, James Lilly became ambassador, I believe it was 1986, and I've been told, again, I said a lot of this is anecdotal, I've been told that they were worried about a revolution in South Korea, that things would get so out of hand that you would have maybe a left-wing government taking over, which then would deal directly with North Korea. I don't believe that was possible. The revolution that would have happened is kicking the military out and getting a democratic government, which is the one that did happen. I don't know if you call that a revolution or not, but it doesn't seem to me there was much connection with North Korea on the part of the major forces then. But you will remember that the Reagan administration in the first few years had a theory that, Gene Kirkpatrick's theory, that authoritarian governments were preferable to communist governments because authoritarian governments evolve and change, whereas communist governments never do. That's why we have so many communist governments in Eastern Europe, by the way. Anyway, I mean, for students, you could do a very interesting paper on the many, not just left-wing, but right-wing dictatorships that collapsed throughout the 1980s up until the fall of the Berlin Wall. But anyway, Lily went out to Korea because Washington was very worried about what was going on. And then Paul Laxalt, I believe, and a couple of other emissaries were trying to get Chun Doo-hwan to see the light of holding a direct election, passing off power. And it was really the force of the street, I think, that ultimately pushed him in that direction. But it represented a sharp change, I think, in the Reagan administration's policies toward authoritarian governments that were allies of our own. They did not want another situation where Benigno Aquino was murdered on the tarmac of Manila Airport in 1983 when he was coming back from exile, also at Harvard like Kim Dae-jung. So you have really the power of the street actually impacting both Washington and Seoul, and I think that's what carried things forward to what was a good conclusion.
Yeah, sorry, yes, probably the last question. And I really appreciate this. You realized me to, you let me to realize that I have to change the title of my course in Korea from the 2 Korea to 3 Korea. So that's, I think, amazing. And my question is actually, I totally agree with your evaluation of the Kim Dae-jung government achievement, is in particular the reconciliation. And I was a member of the committee during the Nomuyon government, but I was fired at the beginning of the Lee Myung-bak government. But my question is, what's the reason why that kind of the achievement is not so successful? Yeah, still so many problems is going on. Nowadays, I devote myself to examine the Korean troops' role in the Vietnam War, and I published a book 2 years ago. And sometimes I'm afraid of meeting the veterans in Korea. As a Korean American, how do you think about the problems in the Korean society?
Well, there is a deep anti-communist current in Korean politics. It traces back to events like Jeju, but above all, the Korean War. There are people who cast their lot with Syngman Rhee and Park Chung-hee and Chun Doo-hwan, and have, of course, maybe their interests went that way and they profited and got their careers boosted by this. But it also reflects the terrible fratricidal violence that's gone on in Korea that creates people on both sides who are just unbending, bloody-minded kojipjengis, people who are just completely determined to smash the other side. I mean, I go to a lot of conferences in Korea, and often there's somebody who stands up during the question session and just denounces the entire panel. It didn't happen this last week, luckily. But it just with tremendous violence of emotion saying, you talk about civil society in North Korea, there's no civil society in North Korea, what are you talking about? There's not even 2 of them. That's a mild comment, but that's, the sort of line that you hear from anti-communists, and then every once in a while we'll see on TV, the burning of Kim Jong-un in effigy and a lot of slogans about the latest missile or bomb test. The violence of emotion is such that you wonder how people ever get along politically in Korea, and that's another way in which the democratic achievement of South Korea is so great. But I mean, when Lee Myung-bak came in, I remember saying to newspapers, well, there's too much toothpaste squeezed out of the tube for him to get it all back in. And he assiduously tried to pack it back in for he and his successor for the next 10 years. But they did not recreate an anti-North Korean, anti-communist coalition that would last. I think their policy toward North Korea was useless. I mean, waiting for them to collapse, and leading to more violence in 2010. And here we are back with a liberal or progressive president, and we'll see what he can do with President Trump to try and move things toward negotiation with North Korea. So I guess the answer to your question is there always is a strong current of right-wing anti-communism. It's been reinforced in recent decades by evangelical Christians that are very strong in South Korea. I love to tout my students. I have another student who did a dissertation just a few months ago on Christian extreme right groups, almost all evangelical, but politically right-wing groups in South Korea. So you have the potential for polarization almost at any time, and yet that anti-communist current in South Korean politics runs alongside a liberal and progressive current that knows much, much more about history than it did before, and much more than to swallow a line that everything that happened that went wrong in post-war Korean history you can blame on the communists. Thank you very much for your questions, and I'll stop there.